The lawyer's voice didn't shake, but my father's did. "Objection," Dad blurted, half rising from the leather chair like he could physically stop the words. This is ridiculous." Across the polished conference table, the estate attorney adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers again. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet, the kind of quiet office smell you only notice when your heart is pounding so hard it feels like it might rattle the light fixtures. My stepmother's nails clicked against her phone screen. My brother stared at the wall behind the attorney's head, jaw clenched like he was trying not to be seen. And me, I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, watching my father realize too late that the sentence he'd thrown at me like a weapon was about to boomerang. "Mr. Callahan," the attorney said calmly, "your mother's will is clear, and the enclosed statement is part of the official record. We are required to read it." My father's eyes found mine. They were wide, furious, and underneath it all scared. "You set me up," he hissed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I just leaned forward a fraction and asked the same question I'd asked days earlier in his kitchen. "Dad," I said softly, "do you still promise to keep your word?" His throat bobbed. He couldn't answer, not with witnesses in the room and the truth on paper. That was the moment everything changed. And to understand why it mattered, you have to go back to the day he decided I wasn't real enough to belong in my own family. It started on a Tuesday evening, the kind of late fall night where the sky turns dark at 4:30 and the wind smells like someone snapped the last dry leaf off a branch. I'd worked a full-day emails, budget meetings, a late client call, then drove straight to my father's house because he'd texted, "Need you here." Family meeting, family meeting. 2 words that can mean anything in a normal household. In ours, they usually meant someone was about to make a decision for me and call it love. My dad lived in a comfortable 2-story outside Columbus, Ohio. Nothing flashy, but the kind of neighborhood where everyone had matching mailboxes and the same landscaping company. His porch light was on when I pulled up, glowing warm like an invitation. It always looked inviting from the outside. Inside was a different story. My stepmother Denise greeted me with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. She smelled like expensive lotion and faint irritation. "Hi, honey," she said like we were close. "We're all in the kitchen." Of course we were. The kitchen was my father's stage. Dad sat at the head of the table, elbows planted, fingers laced like a judge about to deliver a verdict. My brother Evan lounged in a chair with one ankle propped on the rung, scrolling his phone like he'd been dragged in against his will. My stepsister Kelsey wasn't there yet. She lived 2 states away, and usually arrived only for holidays and inheritance-related conversations. On the counter sat a casserole dish covered in foil. Nobody had touched it. "Sit down," Dad said before I could say hello. I pulled out a chair and sat, setting my purse at my feet. My chest already felt tight, but I kept my face neutral. Over 40 teaches you a lot, one of them being how to stay calm while someone else tries to light your life on fire. Dad slid a folder across the table. Thick. Official looking. My name wasn't on it. "I've been talking to the attorney," he began. "About Mom's estate. About her will." The word will made my stomach drop. My grandmother, his mother, had been declining for months. She was still alive, but barely. The last time I visited her at the assisted living facility, she'd held my hand like she was afraid I'd disappear and said, "You're a good girl, Marin. Don't let anyone tell you different." I'd thought she meant it emotionally. Now I realized she might have meant it legally. I didn't know she'd changed anything I said carefully. "Is she okay?" Dad waved that away. "She's fine. This isn't about her health. This is about what's fair." Denise's lips pressed together like she was trying not to smile. Evan finally looked up. "Just say it, Dad." Dad's gaze locked on me. "You're not going to like what I have to say." "I can handle it," I replied, though my palms were damp. He took a breath and his voice hardened. "I'm not going to let you take from this family anymore." The words hit me so hard I felt them in my teeth. "Take," I repeated. "I haven't taken anything." "That's not the point," he snapped. "The point is, he tapped the folder. The point is that Mom's will was written under assumptions. And those assumptions aren't true." My pulse quickened. "What assumptions?" He sat back like he'd rehearsed this, like he'd practiced being cruel in the mirror. "You're not my real daughter," he said. The room went silent. Not shocked silent, not horrified silent. The kind of silent where everyone is waiting to see if you'll crumble because they've already decided you deserve it. I stared at him, not understanding at first. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," Dad said. "I'm done pretending. Your mother lied to me, and I won't let her lie keep stealing from my bloodline." Denise let out a small sigh, like finally. Evan shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't speak. I felt my face go hot, then cold, then numb. My thoughts turned sharp and oddly quiet, like my brain was protecting me by lowering the volume. "You're saying I'm not your daughter," I said slowly, "and you're bringing this up now. Because of Grandma's will." Dad's jaw tightened. Mom's money should stay with blood relatives. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. There it was. The sentence that would echo in my head for days. I could have screamed. I could have thrown my glass of water. I could have done what he wanted, make it about my emotions, so he could call me unstable and dramatic. Instead, I did what I've learned to do when someone tries to corner you. I asked a question. I leaned forward slightly. "Do you promise to keep your word about it?" Then Dad blinked, thrown off. "What?" "If you're telling me I'm not your real daughter," I said, voice steady, "and that only blood relatives deserve the inheritance. Do you promise you're going to stand by that? No backtracking later." "No, I didn't mean it like that." Denise's eyes flicked to Dad, curious now. Evan's phone lowered. He watched me like he'd never seen me before. Dad scoffed. "Of course I'll stand by it. Promise," I pressed. Not angry, just calm. "Say it." He hesitated, and for a split second I saw something behind his confidence, fear maybe, or the instinct that warned him not to say certain words out loud. Then pride took over. "Yes," he said, "I promise." I nodded once, like I'd just received confirmation on a delivery date. "Okay," I said. Denise frowned. "That's it. You're not going to." "No," I interrupted, still quiet. "I'm going to go." Dad's eyebrows shot up. "That's all you have to say, after what I told you." I stood, chair legs scraping softly against the tile. My knees felt shaky, but I didn't let it show. "I heard you," I said. "And you made yourself clear. You think you're going to run off and make me look like the bad guy Dad snapped." I picked up my purse. "You don't need my help with that." That was the only sharp thing I said. And even then, it wasn't loud. I walked out past the untouched casserole, past the staged warmth of the porch light, and into the cold Ohio night. The moment I got into my car, my hands finally started to tremble. Not because I was heartbroken, though I was. Because something in me had clicked into place. If my father wanted to use blood as a weapon, then blood was going to become the truth that set me free. And he had just promised out loud that he would live by his own rule. He had no idea what he'd just agreed to. I didn't go home after leaving my father's house. I drove until the familiar streets blurred into something anonymous: strip malls, gas stations, the glow of chain restaurants lining the highway. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot I'd never shopped at before and shut off the engine. The silence felt thick, pressing against my ears. My hands were still shaking. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and breathed until the shaking eased. Not cried, just breathed. I'd learned long ago that tears for me came later. First came the cataloging, the quiet sorting of facts and feelings like files sliding into a cabinet. "You're not my real daughter." The words replayed not loudly but persistently, like a drip from a faucet you can't ignore once you hear it. What surprised me wasn't how much it hurt. It was how familiar it felt. Because if I was honest with myself, my father had been telling me I didn't belong for most of my life. He'd just finally said it out loud. I grew up in a house where love was measured, rationed, like something expensive. My brother Evan was the golden child, loud, confident, always forgiven. He broke a neighbor's window with a baseball at 14, and Dad laughed it off. "Boys will be boys," he'd said, clapping Evan on the shoulder. When I forgot to call home during my first semester of college because I was drowning in exams and a part-time job, Dad accused me of thinking I was better than everyone else. Different rules, same house. Holidays were the worst. Every Thanksgiving we gathered around the long dining table my grandmother had bought decades earlier, back when solid wood furniture still meant something. Dad carved the turkey like a ritual, handing Evan the first plate, then Denise, then anyone else he deemed worthy of attention. I usually got mine last. Not intentionally, he'd say. Just an oversight. Funny how oversights always land on the same person. Grandma noticed, though. She'd slide me the gravy boat with a wink, or ask me to help her in the kitchen just so she could talk to me without an audience. She never spoke badly about my father. She didn't have to. Her kindness said enough. "You're steady," she once told me while we dried dishes side by side. "That matters more than charm." At the time I thought she was just complimenting my personality. Now I wondered how much she'd known even then. I left for college at 18 and never fully came back. I chose a state school 2 hours away, close enough to visit but far enough to breathe. I paid my way with scholarships, loans, and a job at a hardware store where the owner taught me more about budgeting and responsibility than my father ever did. After graduation, I moved again, this time for work. Nothing glamorous. Project coordination, spreadsheets, deadlines. But I was good at it. Reliable. The kind of person people trusted to clean up messes quietly. Dad barely noticed. He called on birthdays. Sometimes. He remembered Evan's promotions, Kelsey's engagements, Denise's charity events. My life was background noise. Unless he needed something. When Grandma moved into assisted living, Dad suddenly remembered I existed. "You're good with details," he'd said. "You can help with the paperwork." So I did. I visited Grandma weekly, learned the names of the nurses, brought her favorite lemon cookies from the bakery down the street. I listened when she repeated stories, never correcting her when timelines blurred. Dad came once a month, sometimes less. Yet somehow when conversations turned to family responsibility, my name was always mentioned, usually as an obligation, never as a credit. That's why his accusation on Tuesday night hadn't shattered me. It had clarified things. Back in the parking lot, I wiped my hands on my coat and reached for my phone. There were 3 missed calls from Denise already. I didn't listen to the voicemail. I knew what it would say. "He didn't mean it like that. You misunderstood. Let's all calm down." I didn't want calm. I wanted truth. I drove home then to my own small but orderly house, the one I'd bought myself 5 years earlier. I kicked off my shoes, set my purse on the counter, and sat at the kitchen table under a single warm light. And for the first time since my father's promise, I allowed myself to ask the question I'd avoided my entire life. What if he's wrong? Not wrong about being cruel. That part was obvious. Wrong about blood. The idea felt dangerous, like stepping onto ice without knowing how thick it was. But once the thought existed, it refused to go away. I thought about my birth certificate tucked into a file box in the closet. About how my mother had died when I was young, and how few details Dad ever shared about that time. About the way he'd always said, "You're just like her," with a mix of resentment and distance. I'd assumed grief explained everything. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning I called in late to work and pulled the file box from the closet. Old tax returns, insurance policies, a manila envelope labeled "important" in my mother's handwriting. Inside were documents I'd never really looked at before. Hospital discharge papers, a copy of my birth certificate. I studied it carefully, my eyes tracing each line. Father's name filled in. But the handwriting wasn't his. It never had been. I felt a small, steady thud in my chest. Not panic, recognition. That afternoon I scheduled an appointment with an attorney, not the family's, but one recommended by a colleague who specialized in estate and family law. A woman in her 50s with calm eyes and a voice that didn't rush. She listened without interrupting as I explained everything. My father's declaration, his promise, my grandmother's declining health. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "You were smart to ask him to promise." I blinked. I didn't know why I did it. It just felt necessary. "It was," she replied. "Words matter." especially when they're spoken with certainty. She asked about documentation. I told her what I had and what I didn't. We'll need facts, she said gently, not assumptions. Are you prepared for whatever we find? I thought of my father's face across the kitchen table. Confident, certain. I've been preparing my whole life, I said. I just didn't know it. That night Grandma called me. Her voice was thin but clear. Your dad's upset, she said. He says you walked out. I did, I admitted. There was a pause. Then she said, good. I closed my eyes. You deserve the truth, Marin, she added quietly. No matter what anyone's afraid of. When we hung up, I sat in the dark and understood something essential. This wasn't about revenge the way people imagine it, loud, explosive, destructive. This was about finally being seen. And I was done being invisible. By the end of that week, my father started calling again. Not apologizing, calling. There's a difference, and anyone over 40 knows it. Apologies come with pauses, with uncertainty, with the risk of being wrong. Calls like my father's come with assumptions. He assumed I'd cool down. He assumed I'd get scared. He assumed time would soften me the way it always had before. I let the phone ring. On Friday evening, he left a voicemail. His voice was clipped, irritated, layered with the kind of authority he used when he expected obedience. Marin, this has gone far enough. You don't get to walk out and rewrite family history. Call me back. I deleted it. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad writing down everything I knew for certain and everything I didn't. What I knew, my father had publicly declared I wasn't his real daughter. He had tied that declaration directly to my grandmother's will. He had promised clearly, confidently, that only blood relatives deserved the family inheritance. What I didn't know, whether he believed what he said, whether he was bluffing, whether the truth would hurt me more than the lie. But there was one thing I understood with absolute clarity. He hadn't thought this through. People like my father never do. They mistake control for certainty. They assume everyone else is afraid of chaos because they are. They don't realize some of us learned to live inside uncertainty long ago. The attorney I'd met with earlier in the week, Linda, called me Monday morning. I've reviewed the documents you sent, she said. There are some inconsistencies worth exploring. Inconsistencies, I repeated. Yes. Dates. Signatures. And the hospital listed on your birth certificate, are you sure that's where you were born? I thought back. I've never been sure. My dad always said it was a blur, that my mother had complications. Linda hummed thoughtfully. We can request records. It may take time. I have time, I said. And I meant it. Over the next 2 weeks, my life settled into a strange rhythm. I went to work. I answered emails. I made dinner. From the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, everything had shifted. Each evening, I opened files. Medical records requests, insurance forms, old correspondence. I found a faded letter from my mother's sister, someone my father had slowly erased from our lives after my mother died. It was dated 2 months after my birth. Marin looks just like her father, it read. Not your father, her father. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with something steadier. Confirmation that my instincts hadn't betrayed me. Meanwhile, Dad escalated. He showed up at my house one Saturday morning unannounced. I watched him through the window as he stood on my porch, arms crossed, jaw set. He looked older than I remembered, smaller. I didn't open the door. He knocked harder, then again. I know you're in there, he called. I stayed silent. Finally, he leaned closer to the door and said something that made my stomach twist, not because it hurt, but because it revealed exactly who he was. You think you're clever, he said, but you don't have proof. And without proof, you're nothing. The word nothing echoed long after his footsteps faded down the walkway. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother's hands, thin, warm, steady, folding a piece of paper and sliding it into an envelope. When I woke, I called her assisted living facility and asked if I could visit the next day. She was sitting by the window when I arrived, sunlight warming her silver hair. She smiled when she saw me the real kind. "You look tired," she said. "I'm okay," I replied, and this time it was true. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't need to. She listened anyway, nodding gently, as if she could hear the parts I left unsaid. "He made a promise," I told her finally. "About blood." Her eyes sharpened just a fraction. "Did he?" "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Men who make rules like that usually forget who they apply to." That was all she offered. No explanation, no reassurance. But when I stood to leave, she pressed an envelope into my hand. Plain. Unmarked. "Not yet," she whispered when I looked at it questioningly. "When it's time." Driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not sadness, anticipation. Linda called me the following Thursday. "We have confirmation," she said, "and I need you to be sitting down." I already was. "The records show your father is not biologically related to you," she continued carefully. "But that's not the most significant part." I held my breath. "The DNA markers link you directly to your grandmother." The room went very still. Blood. Not the way my father defined it, but real, undeniable, documented blood. The irony landed softly, almost gently. He had drawn a line in the sand without realizing he was standing on the wrong side of it. "I want to proceed carefully," Linda added. "We don't reveal anything yet. Let him stay confident. Let him keep his promise." I closed my eyes and pictured my father in his kitchen, so certain, so smug. "Yes," I said. "Let him." Because quiet revenge isn't about humiliation. It's about letting someone walk all the way into their own truth without pushing them. And my father was walking straight toward his. The assisted living hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books, a combination that somehow felt comforting instead of sad. I'd been walking these halls for months, but that morning felt different. Heavier. Like the air knew something important was about to be said. Grandma's door was cracked open when I arrived. She was sitting in her usual chair by the window, a knitted blanket over her knees, sunlight catching the fine lines on her hands. The television was off. She was waiting. "You came early," she said, smiling. I didn't sleep much, I admitted, pulling a chair closer. She studied my face the way she always had, like she was reading between the lines of my expression instead of listening for words. "Your father's been busy," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "He's very sure of himself." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "He always is. That's been his problem since he was a boy." I hesitated, then reached into my bag and placed the unopened envelope she'd given me days earlier on the small side table between us. "You said not yet," I said. "But I think we're close to yet." Her gaze lingered on the envelope, then lifted to mine. "Have you spoken to an attorney?" "Yes." "Good." She nodded once. "Then it's time for you to understand why I've been so careful all these years." She didn't rush. She never did. She took a sip of water, adjusted the blanket, and then spoke with the same calm certainty she'd used when teaching me how to balance a checkbook or drive in snow. "When your mother came to me, she was terrified. Not of being a single parent, of your father." My chest tightened. I said nothing. "She loved him once," Grandma continued. "But love doesn't survive control." She knew he would never forgive her for telling the truth. "What truth?" I asked, even though I already knew. "That he wasn't your biological father," she said gently. "But he was the man who chose to raise you. Or at least that's what he told her he would do." I swallowed. "So you knew." "I knew from the beginning," she said. "And so did your mother's doctor. And the attorney who helped her prepare safeguards. We hoped your father would grow into the role, that he would choose love over pride." She shook her head slowly. "He never did." I stared at my hands. They looked steady. I didn't feel steady. "He always treated me like I owed him," I said quietly. "Like my existence was a debt." Grandma reached out and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was thin, but her grip was firm. Because to him it was. He stayed when he could have left, and he wanted to be paid for that choice for the rest of his life. Tears finally burned behind my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I didn't want pity. I wanted understanding. And the blood connection, I asked. Linda said, "Yes," Grandma interrupted. "You are my blood. Not by chance, not by rumor, by truth." She leaned back, exhausted but resolute. "Your mother was my daughter Maren, not by birth but by bond. She came into my life when she was young and scared, and she stayed because we chose each other. Blood isn't only made in delivery rooms. The room felt smaller, like the walls were listening." "I put it in writing," Grandma said. "Years ago. I made sure the legal record reflected what mattered. I trusted your father wouldn't force my hand. And now," I asked. "And now," she said softly, "he's done it himself." She gestured toward the envelope. "That contains a statement of intent. It explains my choices, my reasoning, and the documentation. It will be read with the will." I shook my head in disbelief. "He thinks he's protecting the family fortune." She smiled sadly. "He's protecting his pride. Those are not the same thing." We sat in silence for a long moment. I listened to the distant sound of a cart rolling down the hallway, a nurse laughing softly with a resident. Life continuing unaware of the quiet reckoning taking shape. "Do you regret not telling me sooner?" I asked. Grandma's eyes filled just slightly, every day. But I also knew that knowing too early would have cost you something. Children need roots, even imperfect ones. She squeezed my hand. "Now you're grown. You don't need permission to know who you are." When I stood to leave, she surprised me by pulling me into a hug. She was smaller than she used to be, but the embrace was strong. "No matter what happens next," she whispered, "remember this family is responsibility, not DNA." Driving home, the weight of the truth settled into me, not as pain, but as clarity. My father had spent years drawing lines defining worth, rationing belonging. He never once considered that the line he drew might lead straight back to me, and that when the will was read, it wouldn't be anger that silenced the room. It would be the undeniable sound of the truth finally being spoken out loud. The conference room was smaller than I expected. I don't know why I'd imagined something grander, high ceilings, dramatic lighting, a sense of ceremony. Maybe because so much power had been quietly accumulating around this moment. But in reality, it was just a long oak table, 8 leather chairs, and a framed print of a sailing boat on calm water hanging slightly crooked on the wall. Very American, very ordinary. That's how most life-altering moments arrive. My father sat 2 seats down from me, stiff-backed hands folded tightly in front of him. He wore the same navy blazer he always did for serious occasions, like it was armor. Denise sat beside him, lips pressed, thin eyes sharp and alert. Evan slouched across the table, arms crossed, already bored, already confident. I noticed my father hadn't looked at me yet. Good. The attorney, Mr. Harris, cleared his throat and adjusted the folder in front of him. His movements were precise, practiced. He'd done this hundreds of times. For him, this was procedure. For us, it was a reckoning. "As you all know," he began, "we are here to read and execute the last will and testament of Eleanor Callahan." The sound of Grandma's name landed heavily in my chest. I kept my gaze steady, my breathing even. I'd cried enough already in private in safe places. Today wasn't for tears. Mr. Harris continued outlining the formalities. Personal effects, charitable donations, trust allocations. It was all very calm, very orderly. My father relaxed visibly as the reading progressed. I could see it happening, the quiet confidence returning. The certainty that the universe would arrange itself the way he believed it should. He leaned back slightly, one ankle crossing over the other. Blood would win. It always had. Then Mr. Harris paused. "There is," he said, an additional statement attached to the will, "a clarification of intent requested by Mrs. Callahan." My father's posture stiffened. Denise tilted her head. "A clarification." Yes, the attorney replied evenly. It was written and notarized some years ago. We are legally obligated to read it aloud. I felt my father's eyes on me for the first time since I'd entered the room. Sharp, questioning. I met his gaze calmly. Mr. Harris unfolded a single sheet of paper. My mother wanted this read verbatim, he said. So please allow me to do so without interruption. Dad opened his mouth. Please, Mr. Harris added firmer now. The silence thickened. To my family, the attorney read, I have lived long enough to see how power and pride can distort love. This statement exists not to punish but to clarify. My father's jaw tightened. I am aware that questions of blood have been raised in recent years, Mr. Harris continued. Let me be clear, I define family by responsibility, consistency, and care, not convenience. Evan shifted in his chair. Denise's eyes narrowed. My father sat very still. Marin has shown up when others have not. She has cared for me without obligation and without expectation. That matters. My throat tightened, but I kept my face neutral. Regarding lineage, Mr. Harris read, I confirm that Marin is legally and biologically connected to me in a manner consistent with inheritance law supported by documentation on file. The air seemed to leave the room. My father lurched forward. That's impossible. Mr. Harris raised a hand. Sir, you're saying she's Dad's voice cracked just slightly. That she's more entitled than I'm saying, Mr. Harris interrupted calmly, that your mother anticipated disputes based on bloodline. And she ensured that those disputes would be settled by facts, not feelings. He turned another page. There is one more relevant clause, he said. One that directly addresses prior verbal statements made by family members. My father's face drained of color. Mr. Harris read slowly, deliberately. Any heir who asserts that Marin does not belong to this family, or attempts to exclude her on the basis of blood alone, affirms my intent that my estate be distributed according to the definitions outlined herein without amendment or appeal. Denise whispered, What does that mean? It meant my father's own words had sealed the outcome. Blood. Promise. No backtracking. Mr. Harris looked directly at my father. Your mother was aware of your views, Mr. Callahan. She documented them, and she structured her will accordingly. The room was completely silent. No gasps, no shouting. Just the quiet sound of a man realizing he had built his entire argument on a foundation that didn't belong to him. My father turned to me, eyes wide, searching my face for something. Triumph, cruelty, satisfaction. I gave him none of it. Do you remember what you told me? I asked gently. He swallowed. Marin. You said only blood relatives deserve the family fortune, I continued, and I asked if you promised to keep your word. His hands trembled slightly on the table. You said yes. He looked down. Mr. Harris closed the folder. The will stands as written. There will be no revisions. Evan stared at the wall. Denise sat frozen. And my father, who had spent his life deciding who belonged, finally understood what it felt like to be on the outside of his own rules. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The parking lot outside the law office was almost empty when we stepped out. Late afternoon sunlight slanted across the pavement, turning the cars into long, quiet shadows. No one spoke at first. We'd all just been handed something heavy, and there wasn't a script for what came next. Denise walked ahead, heels clicking too fast, her posture rigid with embarrassment. Evan lingered, stuffing his hands into his pockets, avoiding everyone's eyes. He looked less angry than confused, like a man who just realized the rules he'd memorized didn't actually protect him. My father stood still. For a long moment he didn't move at all. He stared at the glass doors of the office as if they might open again and reverse everything that had just happened. His shoulders, once so squared and certain, seemed to sag under a weight he'd never prepared for. Marin, he said finally. I turned. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Not commanding, not sharp, just unsure. Can we talk? I considered him carefully. Not out of spite, out of caution. Because some doors once reopened can crush you if you're not ready. Yes, I said, but not here. We ended up at a small diner down the road, the kind with vinyl booths and laminated menus that hadn't changed in 20 years. The hostess seated us without comment. To her, we were just another pair of family members not quite meeting each other's eyes. Dad slid into the booth across from me. He didn't reach for the menu. I didn't know he said almost immediately. I folded my hands on the table. You didn't ask. He flinched. I mean, I didn't know about the blood, he corrected. Your grandmother. She never said she didn't need to, I replied calmly. You were certain without facts. That was your choice. He stared at the tabletop, tracing a faint scratch in the wood with his finger. I thought if I drew a clear line, things would stay simple. I let out a soft, humorless breath. You didn't want simple. You wanted control. The waitress arrived cheerful and oblivious. Coffee, yes, Dad said quickly. Please, no cream for me, I added. When she left, the silence returned. I never meant to hurt you like that, he said. I met his eyes. You didn't mean to be caught. That landed harder than I expected. He winced, then nodded slowly. You're right, he admitted. I was afraid. Afraid I'd lose something. Power, I said gently. He didn't argue. I built my whole sense of family around being needed, he continued. Around being the one who decided. When your mother died and you stayed, I told myself I was doing the right thing. But every time you didn't depend on me, it felt like rejection. I listened. Not because I owed him absolution, but because this was the first honest thing he'd ever said to me. So you punished me for surviving, I said. He closed his eyes. The coffee arrived. He didn't touch it. I can't undo what I said, he murmured. I can't take back the promise. No, I agreed. You can't. Another pause. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. What happens now? I thought of Grandma's hands, of her envelope, of the years I'd spent shrinking myself to fit a role he'd assigned. Now I said, you live with the truth, just like I had to. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, but I don't want to lose you. I studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the pride that had finally cracked. You already did, I said quietly, but that doesn't mean we can't build something different. His breath hitched. Different, how honest, I replied. Without conditions, without tests. He looked up, hope flickering dangerously close to expectation. And if I fail, then we keep our distance, I said. Not out of punishment, out of self-respect. That seemed to settle into him. Not comfortably, but truth rarely does. We left the diner separately. No hug, no dramatic reconciliation. Just a shared understanding that the silence between us would never be the same again. Driving home, I felt lighter, not because I'd won, but because I hadn't lost myself in the process. Quiet revenge isn't about watching someone fall apart. It's about standing still while the truth does its work, and it always does. The house was quiet when I got home that evening. Not the empty kind of quiet that echoes, but the settled kind, the kind that feels earned. I hung my coat by the door, set my keys on the counter, and stood there for a moment, letting the stillness wrap around me. For the first time in weeks, my chest didn't feel tight. Grandma passed 3 days later, peacefully, in her sleep. The nurse told me she'd asked for the window to be cracked open before nightfall, even though it was cold. She said she wanted fresh air. The nurse smiled, like she was ready to go somewhere. At the small graveside service, my father stood a few feet away from me. Not beside me. Not apart either, just nearby. Respecting the distance I hadn't even had to ask for. Afterward, there were no speeches, no arguments, no whispered resentments. Just quiet faces and people going back to their lives, each carrying a version of her that belonged only to them. In the weeks that followed, the estate was settled exactly as Grandma had planned. I didn't announce what I received. I didn't need to. Money has a way of revealing itself through behavior, not words. I paid off my mortgage. I set up a small education fund in Grandma's name for first-generation college students, kids who needed roots but didn't always get them. I donated the rest to causes she'd supported quietly for years. No press, no family meeting, just responsibility. My father called once a month after that. Sometimes we talked about neutral things, the weather, a news story, a recipe he was trying. Sometimes we didn't talk long at all. What mattered was that he no longer spoke over me. He listened. Carefully, like he knew the cost of not doing so. We never went back to what we were, but we did move forward into something more honest. One afternoon, months later, he said something I never expected. I spent years thinking blood was everything he admitted. I was wrong. I didn't respond right away. Because some realizations aren't meant to be met with applause. They're meant to be lived with, I finally said. He agreed. And that was enough. What I learned through all of this is simple, but it took me over 40 years to understand it. People will use family as a weapon when they're afraid of losing control. They'll rewrite history, twist definitions, and draw lines that serve only themselves. And if you let them, you'll spend your life trying to earn a place you already deserve. Quiet revenge isn't about humiliation or destruction. It's about refusing to disappear. It's about letting truth stand where shouting never could. And it's about choosing dignity even when someone else doesn't. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when you were told you didn't belong, or when you had to choose between peace and self-respect, I invite you to pause and reflect. Maybe share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe sit with the question it leaves behind. And if you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength, hard-earned truth, and dignity that doesn't beg for permission, consider staying with us. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told without raising a voice.